Welcome back to this next video in which we are studying headaches. Okay, so in the previous video we studied the anatomy of the anterior, middle and posterior meningeal arteries, and all of those arteries run in those outer layers of the meninges, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and they supply the outer meninges with blood. And of course the reason we're studying this is because a very dense site of meningeal nociceptors is in the walls of arteries that are within the meninges, and those meningeal arteries, their walls will indeed be densely innervated with meningeal nociceptors. Now, the second category of arteries that is within the meningeal layers are those that are in the subarachnoid space on top of the pia mater, and these arteries are actually going to be supplying the brain tissue. They're just at the moment running in the subarachnoid space. Now, again, coming back to the discussion of anatomical specimens in anatomical laboratories, if you've seen a specimen of the brain and it's got the arteries left on top of it, you might have seen a specimen of the brain where the top of the brain, the surface of the brain, is covered in arteries, in blood vessels, and these blood vessels are the blood vessels that we're about to discuss. They are the ones that are in the subarachnoid space. The brain specimen that you are seeing will have the pia mater left on, and on top of the pia mater, those arteries are present there, and they would then be in the subarachnoid space. That's the category of arteries that we want to discuss, and those arteries are supplying the brain with blood. So, when discussing arteries that supply the brain, we split them into two categories. The ones that are currently running outside of the pia mater, and therefore well outside of the brain, and which will give off branches which will penetrate through the pia mater and then actually supply the brain. And those arteries are known as extra-axial arteries, so I'll just write this down here. So, the ones that are currently in the subarachnoid space, those are called extra-axial brain arteries, and as I say, they will give off branches that will then penetrate through the pia mater to the brain underlying and supply the brain with blood. The blood vessels that are actually inside of the brain, so inside of the pia mater, they've already penetrated through the pia mater and they're actually running inside of the brain, those are called intra-axial brain arteries. So let me write this down here. So this is an important division. We divide the brain arteries, the arteries that are supplying the brain tissue, into intraaxial and extraaxial. The intraaxial ones are the ones that are actually running inside of the brain parenchyma. They have penetrated through the pia mater, that inner meninge that lines the surface of the brain, and they're now within the actual brain tissue. The extraaxial ones are the ones that I'm interested in discussing because they are the ones that run in the subarachnoid space, i.e. they're within the meningeal layers, and their walls can be innervated by meningeal nociceptors, so that's why we're interested in discussing some examples here. Okay, so we're now going to discuss extraaxial brain arteries. So, we're not, of course, going to be able to discuss absolutely all of them. As I say, if you've seen one of these anatomical specimens that's still got the extraaxial arteries left on top, there's absolutely loads of them. We're just going to discuss some major examples of extraaxial brain arteries so that we've got something to think about when we're talking about these arteries. So, the examples that I'm going to go over are the anterior cerebral arteries, the middle cerebral arteries, the posterior cerebral arteries, the superior cerebellar arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So, let's begin then with the anterior cerebral arteries. So this picture here is absolutely perfect for us to discuss the anterior cerebral arteries because they come off the internal carotid arteries. So here we've got our internal carotid artery coming through the cavernous sinus here, and then it's gone through the roof of the cavernous sinus, which of course is made up of meningeal, dura mater, and then arachnoid mater. It's penetrated through those, and it's now in the subarachnoid space, and it's going back on itself here over the top of the cavernous sinus, and it's in the subarachnoid space. And the first branch that we've discussed that it gives off is the ophthalmic artery. Now, we're going to add on to that picture the second branch that it gives off, which is the anterior cerebral artery, and I'll do this in green here. So the second major branch that the internal carotid artery gives off is this anterior cerebral artery here in green. So let me write down its name. So this is the anterior so it's going to supply the anterior portion, and it's the cerebral, so it's going to supply the cerebral hemispheres, and then it's an artery. So anterior cerebral artery, and for short, the anterior cerebral artery is often abbreviated down to the ACA, just as the internal carotid artery was abbreviated down to the ICA. Okay, so of course we have two internal carotid arteries, one on either side, and both of them are going to give off an anterior cerebral artery. So I think actually I'll just draw another picture of the cranial cavity, and you'll notice that I have cleared the board up a little bit. I've got rid of a lot of our previous pictures, and that's because the file size was becoming too big to keep all of the previous pictures. So this means that I'm going to have to reproduce a few pictures, but I've kept the major ones that would have taken me a long time to reproduce. So I'm just going to draw a quick picture, and it's this picture that we've seen many times before, which is the cranial cavity viewed from above. So firstly, let me just draw a little oval shape here. So again, we've chopped off the top of the skull, and we're now looking down into the cranial cavity, and I want to now demarcate the three cranial fossae. So let's start off with the anterior cranial fossa. So here is the clinoid processes. So there's our anterior cranial fossa. Then let's put in the sella turcica here, where the pituitary fossa is, and then at the front we've got the chiasmatic groove, and then we've got the petrous portions of the temporal bone here, demarcating the posterior aspect of the middle cranial fossa, and then we'll put on foramen magnum to complete up this picture. So here are our three cranial fossa that we've discussed previously. So why have I drawn this? Because I want to put on the internal carotid arteries so that I can show you the anterior cerebral arteries coming off them. So thick pen at the ready. So here I'm going to mark on either side of the sella turcica here, we have our internal carotid arteries here. And let me just make sure you understand which bit of the internal carotid artery I'm showing here. This is the bit that's above the cavernous sinus. It's this bit, so it's going backwards. At the front here is this penetrated through the roof of the cavernous sinus, and it's now moving backwards in the subarachnoid space. And of course, at the front then, it is giving off the anterior cerebral arteries that are going to move over, they're going to move in this direction here, into the anterior cranial fossa, like so. Okay, so remember, all of this bone is covered by the outer meninges, the dura mater and then the arachnoid mater, and on top of the arachnoid mater we're going to have subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space here is continuous with subarachnoid space over here, so it's very possible for you to create these arteries going in the subarachnoid space here. Now, where are they actually going to go next? Well, it's difficult to show on this picture, but they're going to loop back upwards, and they're going to go in between the longitudinal fissure. So, where's that picture? I have actually brought this picture. So here is the picture where we're looking at the two cerebral hemispheres from above, and here is the longitudinal fissure, and joining the two cerebral hemispheres there, you've got the corpus callosum. And remember, all of this is going to be covered by pia mater, and this picture is also important here. Remember that there is cerebral cortex on either side, so each of the cerebral hemispheres has this huge portion of cerebral cortex here that is facing into the longitudinal fissure. So this gap has cerebral cortex facing into it, and all of this cerebral cortex will be covered by pia mater, and then the pia mater will run over the corpus callosum, and then it will be continuous with the pia mater covering the other side. Remember, the pia mater goes into all the nooks and crannies, all the little crevices. It follows the shape of the brain perfectly. Now, of course, separating the two cerebral hemispheres, you'll then have the falx cerebri, and that we've discussed, which is this dural fold, so the meningeal dura mater folds inwards. But remember also that the meningeal dura mater will then be covered by a layer of arachnoid mater. And then between the arachnoid mater on either side and the pia mater that covers the cerebral cortex that faces into the longitudinal fissure, you're going to have an area of subarachnoid space, and this is the area that the anterior cerebral arteries are going to ascend in. So, to make this absolutely clear, imagine that you're a little man currently in the white matter of the left cerebral hemisphere here. If you wanted to get into the right cerebral hemisphere, we're going to chisel through. So we chisel through the cerebral cortex that faces longitudinal fissure here. We chisel through the pia mater that covers that. We then get into subarachnoid space. We then hit the falx cerebri, and the first layer of the falx cerebri we hit is arachnoid mater. Then we go for a double layer of meningeal dura mater, which is the actual dural fold. Then we go for another layer of arachnoid mater on the other side, then a layer of subarachnoid space, then through pia mater, and then we'd go through the cerebral cortex and end up in the right cerebral hemisphere. So let me just draw a little picture of this to make sure that you're absolutely clear about the structure of the falx cerebri and how there will be subarachnoid space on either side of the falx cerebri before you then get to the pia mater covering the cerebral cortex that faces into the longitudinal fissure. And this will be going all the way around, but I'm just going to draw it for this anterior bit here. So imagine cutting this little bit out, and I'm going to draw it much bigger over here. So, in yellow then. So, here is the anterior portion of the cerebral hemispheres, and then we'll have the corpus callosum there, and then here as well. So that is just this portion cut out, basically. And let me go back to a thinner pen. Right, so that is actually representing the brain. In yellow, all of that is brain. We've got cerebral cortex here, then the corpus callosum here, and cerebral cortex here. Now, all of that is going to be covered by pia mater, which I'm now going to do here in green. So the pia mater is going to be just on the top here in green, and I'll try and get it as close as possible so that it's as realistic as possible. So there is our pia mater covering the surface of the brain perfectly. Now, next, let's put in the meningeal dura mater, so the actual dural fold here. And I won't bother drawing the periosteal dura mater. We know that that doesn't fold in. That's just going to be adhered to the skull here. In fact, actually, it won't take long to draw the periosteal dura mater, so I will draw the periosteal dura mater. So here in purple, this is the periosteal dura mater that's bound to the skull anteriorly. Okay, and now here is the meningeal dura mater in this mint green colour, and I'm not going to bother drawing the dural venous sinuses, but of course there would be the superior sinus, superior sagittal sinus, and there would be the inferior sagittal sinus as well, but they just make it more complicated, so I'm not going to bother trying to put those in, but they would be in this position here, in this position here. So there is the meningeal dura mater. The final thing that I need to put in is the arachnoid mater. Let me pick a colour for this. We'll do this in red. So this will be adhered to the meningeal dura mater like this. Let me try and get it as close as possible to the meningeal dura mater, like so. And now you can see that there is a space between the arachnoid mater here and the pia mater, and that's all subarachnoid space. That's going to be full with cerebrospinal fluid. So the reason I have drawn this picture is to illustrate to you that on either side of the falx cerebri there is this little space of subarachnoid space here, and that will be full of CSF, and that will be continuous with the subarachnoid space that is underneath the orbitofrontal cortex, which is on this other picture up here where the anterior cerebral arteries currently are. So what they're going to do is they're going to come up like this, and they're currently underneath these portions of the frontal lobe, and they're then going to ascend in these subarachnoid space portions here on either side of the falx cerebri. So just marking them on this picture, and I'm going to go for a ridiculous colour just so that it stands out rather than red, because red I've used for the arachnoid mater. They will be in these positions here, in that subarachnoid space on either side of the falx cerebri. So we've got the left anterior cerebral artery here and the right anterior cerebral artery here. Now, let me show also the structure of the anterior cerebral arteries on this picture over here where we have our sagittal section. So remember, we have cut through the brain sagittally. We are seeing the right side of the brain, of course, here. We're seeing all of this cerebral cortex of the right cerebral hemisphere that faces into the longitudinal fissure. All of this will be covered by pia mater, and then there will be that subarachnoid space that I've shown over here. Okay, so now let me mark on where the anterior cerebral artery is going to come. So I'm drawing the right one in this case. So of course, it will be lateral initially to the right side of the hypothalamus. Then it will come under here, and it's going to come medially, and it's coming into the anterior cranial fossa here. This is the bottom of the anterior cranial fossa, and it's going to go up like this, and it's going to reflect back there. And to show this, I'm going to get a very thick pen, otherwise it's not going to show up. And actually, I'll do it in red. I think red's probably the colour that will show up best here. So it comes up here, and then it's going to go around the corpus callosum like this, as I'm showing here. And let me just actually do it in even a thicker pen so that it shows up even better. So here it goes, and it goes right round the corpus callosum, and that's all it can do. It can't go lower than the corpus callosum because the corpus callosum is covered by pia mater. So to stay in the subarachnoid space, it has to stay above the corpus callosum. Now, this anterior cerebral artery gives off several major branches. Well, actually, it gives off loads and loads of branches. I'm going to tell you some of the major branches it gives off. So, one of the first major branches that it gives off is a branch that comes off down here and is going to supply the orbitofrontal cerebral cortex. So remember, it's in the subarachnoid space. All of this cerebral cortex is covered by pia mater. It can now throw off a branch down here that's going to go underneath the cerebral cortex here and onto the surface of the orbitofrontal cerebral cortex and supply that orbital frontal cerebral cortex, i.e. branches will branch off from this artery, penetrate through the pia mater that covers the orbitofrontal cortex, and then supply the brain tissue. Okay, and that artery is known as the orbitofrontal artery. So let me annotate this on here. So that is the orbitofrontal artery, which is a perfectly sensible name for it because it's going to supply the orbital frontal cortex. And again, of course, this will be happening on both sides. So you'll have a left orbitofrontal artery coming off the left anterior cerebral artery, and you'll have a right orbitofrontal artery coming off the right anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so then the anterior cerebral artery continues onwards, and then at this sort of level it splits into two major branches. One which I've already put on there, and then another one which I need to now add on. Whoops. So here is coming the other one that goes in this sort of position, like so. Okay, and they run parallel to one another. Remember, they're in the subarachnoid space, the pia mater is covering the cerebral cortex, and they're on top of that pia mater. And that's why it's quite good to study these arteries, because it really does test whether you understand the anatomy of the meninges, and hopefully by exploring this you will get a better understanding of the meninges in your head. So, here comes the anterior cerebral artery on the right-hand side. It's given off the orbitofrontal artery, it continues on here, and then it's dividing into these two branches, one of which remains very close to the corpus callosum, and one of which goes further away from the corpus callosum, and both of these are on the right-hand side. So the one that's staying very close to the corpus callosum, this will stay in this sort of position and run over the corpus callosum. The one that's going to be further away, it'll be in this sort of position. And you can imagine that this picture is actually showing a section anywhere along. It doesn't necessarily have to show this bit right at the front. It could have been showing the longitudinal fissure anywhere along the length of the longitudinal fissure with the falx cerebri here. So this one that's further away from the corpus callosum would be further up like this. So what are these two arteries then, the major two branches, terminal branches of the anterior cerebral artery called? Where can I find a little space to label this on? The one that remains very close to the corpus callosum, that is called the pericallosal artery, because it's going around the corpus callosum. Peri means around, callosal obviously means pertaining to the corpus callosum, so it's a good name for it, the pericallosal artery. Then the one that's further away, that's called the callosomarginal artery, so it's nearer the margin. So callosomarginal artery. So the anterior cerebral artery splits into the pericallosal artery, and then this one that's further away and running in parallel to it, which is the callosomarginal artery. And again, both of these will give off branches that will penetrate through the pia mater and actually become intraaxial and supply brain tissue. So both of those are extraaxial blood vessels in the subarachnoid space, and their walls can be innervated by meningeal nociceptors. Whereas the intraaxial blood vessels, they're not going to be innervated by meningeal nociceptors, and indeed they're not going to be innervated by nociceptors full stop. So it's only the extraaxial brain vessels that are going to be innervated by nociceptors. Okay, so those are the major branches that I wanted to show you then of the anterior cerebral arteries. Before we move on to the middle cerebral arteries, there is just one more thing that I need to tell you about the anterior cerebral arteries, which is that they have a communicating link between them. So remember, both of these anterior cerebral arteries here, and indeed I think I'll just label them up on my little picture here. So these are the anterior cerebral arteries here. Okay, both of them, remember, are in the subarachnoid space. So this bone here is covered by the external meninges, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. They are running on top of that in the subarachnoid space, and then the pia mater will be on top of them, covering the orbitofrontal cerebral cortexes. So you can very easily connect these two with a little branch, and that branch will just run through the subarachnoid space. So what I'm trying to convince you is that these are in a connectable container, basically. You can produce a branch off one of the anterior cerebral arteries and connect it to the other without leaving the subarachnoid space. And I hope your understanding, your visualization of the meninges is good enough to understand that. So that branch that is going to link them, it has a name. It is called the anterior communicating artery. So anterior communicating artery, because it's going to communicate between the two anterior cerebral arteries. So here it is on this picture. It connects the two anterior cerebral arteries. Now, this is going to form part of a structure that we're going to overall, by the end of this video, understand. We'll have a complete picture of it. And this structure is called the circle of Willis. So there is actually a complete circle of arteries in the brain called the circle of Willis. And these are all extra-axial brain arteries that form this circle of Willis. And if you were a little man swimming in the blood, you could actually go round this cycle, basically. So the anterior cerebral arteries and indeed the anterior communicating arteries are going to form the front part of this structure called the circle of Willis. Now, if you haven't heard of this before, don't worry, by the end of the video I will have drawn you a complete picture. You shouldn't understand it as of yet, because I have not shown you the full thing yet. Okay, right, so by the end of this video we will understand the circle of Willis. So, next one that we want to discuss, we've done the anterior cerebral arteries, a major example of an extra-axial artery, and they're going to supply, most definitely, those medial portions of cerebral cortex that face into the longitudinal fissure, as well as the orbitofrontal cortex. So a lot of that sort of anterior portion of the brain is going to be supplied by the anterior cerebral arteries. The next ones that we want to discuss are the middle cerebral arteries. So let me change colour again. So we now want to discuss the middle cerebral arteries, which are abbreviated down to the MCAs. So I hope I don't need to write that full name out. Middle cerebral arteries. I'm sure that's clear for you. So, the middle cerebral arteries, this is rather a more complicated story to tell. It's going to involve me drawing a new picture that we've not drawn before, a coronal section of the brain. So where do the middle cerebral arteries come from? Well, you might have been wondering, what happens to the internal carotid arteries? We've seen that they reflect back and they run over the roof of the cavernous sinus, like shown in this picture, in the subarachnoid space. But where do they go next? Well, the answer is they become the middle cerebral arteries, and the middle cerebral arteries are going to go laterally. So, let me mark this on this picture. I'll just get a thicker pen. So, here we have our internal carotid arteries here. They're coming backwards, and now they're going to become the middle cerebral arteries that are going to go laterally. So let me put this here. So here they go, laterally. Now, why is the middle cerebral artery complicated to understand? Well, the reason it's complicated to understand is that it's not going to remain extra-axial. It's actually going to go intra-axial for a while, and then it's going to become extra-axial again. So, how is it actually going to go laterally like this? You might think, well, maybe it will just go underneath the temporal lobe so that it can remain in the subarachnoid space, but it doesn't. It instead goes right through the temporal lobe. It penetrates through the pia mater, it then goes through the brain tissue, and then it penetrates the pia mater again to get back into the subarachnoid space. So, to understand this, I now want to take a coronal section of the brain. I want to cut through the brain in a coronal section straight down at this sort of position here. and I'm going to cut through at a position where we'll just about see the pituitary gland. So we'll see the pituitary gland below, we'll cut through the hypothalamus, and we'll cut through all of the cerebral hemispheres, of course. So this is a picture that we haven't seen so far, so we're going to now see a coronal section. So bear with me whilst I draw this. So I'd like a nice thick pen for this. So I'll start at the top. Just to orient you, we're going to imagine that we are looking from the back. So the side that I'm drawing at the moment is going to be the left-hand side. So here is the left cerebral hemisphere, like so. And then, of course, in the middle, we're going to have the longitudinal fissure. So here's the longitudinal fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres. And then at the bottom of that, of course, you'll have the corpus callosum. So here is the right cerebral hemisphere. Now, why have I stopped here? Because it gets complicated here. There is another fissure, the lateral fissure, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobes. So this fissure here, this is called the lateral fissure. So I don't think I've actually told you the name of that fissure before, so I'll just write this down here. So that fissure that we just learned about, that's called the lateral fissure, and that's a sensible name for it because it is on the lateral side of the cerebral hemispheres. So the fissure in between the frontal and parietal lobes and the temporal lobes, that is called the lateral fissure. And of course you have the left lateral fissure and the right lateral fissure. And now in my picture here, we are going to see these lateral fissures. We have now come down to where the lateral fissures are going to be. And they're more complicated than the longitudinal fissures. You might be expecting me now to just draw a little gash inwards here as well. But actually it opens up, and there's a great big portion of cerebral cortex that is present inside the lateral fissure called the insular cortex. So let me just draw this on here. So here's the lateral fissure, then it opens up, and here, that portion of cerebral cortex facing in, that is called the insular cortex. And then we come down like so, and I'll just draw it now on the other side and try and get it as symmetrical as possible. So here's the insular cortex, and then here below, of course, is the temporal lobes. Right, so just to absolutely stress this point home, all of this is going to be lined by pia mater, and the pia mater will go inside of the lateral fissure and will line all of this cerebral cortex that I'm showing in yellow. Remember, the pia mater and the cerebral cortex surface, they are one. Even when you have these very complicated invaginations of the cerebral cortex, the pia mater will follow it. Right, so now the complicated bit at the bottom. What happens here at the bottom? Well, here at the bottom is going to be where the hypothalamus is going to be present here, and also the pituitary gland is going to be facing down. So let me just draw this in here as best as I can. So here is where the pituitary gland is going to dangle down in this position here, like so, and it's not perfectly in the middle. In fact, I might try and do that again to try and get the pituitary gland perfectly in the middle. Okay, so here I think would be a better place to put the pituitary gland. Okay, and there we go. Right, and just connect that up. Okay, so here is the pituitary gland dangling down, therefore this is the hypothalamus above, and what, I want you to scream it at your computer screens, what sits in these spaces on either side of the pituitary gland? The cavernous sinuses, so they are in this position. All of this cerebral cortex here is going to be covered by the pia mater, all of this brain surface, this is all covered by pia mater, including the pituitary gland, and then of course we'll have subarachnoid space, and then we'll have the cavernous sinus, and the top walls of the cavernous sinus will be made up of arachnoid mater, and then meningeal dura mater. Then you'll have the cavernous sinus, and you'll go down, and the floor of the cavernous sinus will be periosteal dura mater. So I hope that's all clear. So, this picture is going rather well. Let's add a few more structures onto it. So to make the hypothalamus clearer, let's put in the third ventricle here. So we have taken the coronal section, we've gone right through this level here, we've chopped through here, we're seeing both sides, left and right, from behind. If we chop through, of course the hypothalamus is hollow, you have a left side and a right side of the hypothalamus, and in between there is the third ventricle. So let me just mark on this picture the third ventricle. So it will be in this position, like so. So this is the left wall of the hypothalamus, and this is the right wall of the hypothalamus. What other structures do I want to mark on here? Other structures that you will see, of course, you will have cut through the lateral ventricles. You will have cut through ventricle number 1 and 2, the first and second ventricles, and they'll be up in these positions here. Now, when you take a coronal section, you don't get a very good view of the lateral ventricles. We'll discuss the lateral ventricles later on when we come on to hydrocephalus as part of intracranial hypertension, but they have very, very fancy shapes that really, to see, you need to be looking from the side, not in a coronal section. We're just going to have cut through a little bit of them, but they're going to be up in this position here. So here is the septum separating the two of them, and hopefully you can remember what the name of that is. That is the septum pellucidum, which we talked about earlier. And then you'll see a little bit of the lateral ventricle here, so that's the right lateral ventricle, and I'll try and make the left one as symmetrical as possible, and there is the left lateral ventricle. So as I say, they're not particularly interesting when you take a coronal section like this, because we've just cut literally through them. To see their structure properly, you need to see them from the side. They have really fancy curved crab's claw sort of shapes, but we're just seeing a tiny little section of one here, of the anterior portion of the left and right ones. Okay, but know that they are separated down the middle here by the septum pellucidum. Okay, so we've put on the third ventricle, we've put on the lateral ventricles that we will see. The other structures that I want to put on this picture are the caudate nuclei and also the lenticular nuclei. Now let me just stress that we're not going to see the thalami because we have taken a section too far forwards. We've gone through the hypothalamus here. Remember, the thalami are behind the hypothalamus. We won't see the thalami, but if we were further back, they'd be in this sort of position where the hypothalamus is in our picture instead. Instead, as I say, I'm going to put on structures that we haven't discussed yet in this video. They're very, very important neuroanatomical structures, but they're not very important as far as headaches are discussed, and therefore I'm just going to put them on this picture as landmark structures, but we're not really going to discuss what their functions are. Okay, so the caudate nuclei is what I'm going to put on first. So I'll just write down the name here. So you have a left and a right caudate nucleus. I'm going to put both of them on. And again, these structures, you can't really get a proper view of their shape from looking at a coronal section like this. You're going to get a very boring little picture of the caudate nuclei on this coronal section. Really, to look at them properly, you need to be looking at them from their sides, and they sort of follow the claw shape of the lateral ventricles, and they're just inside of them. So, they are going to be in cut section in these positions in pink there. So just lateral to the lateral ventricles, running along with, in the same sort of shape as the lateral ventricles, you've got the caudate nuclei. We're not getting a very impressive picture of them here because we've taken a coronal section and we're just seeing the cut surface of them there. Okay, so those are the caudate nuclei. Other things that we're going to see on here, we are going to see the lenticular nuclei. Now, these are called the lenticular nuclei because they look like lenses, and they consist of two major components. They consist of the putamen, and of course you have a left lenticular nucleus and a right lenticular nucleus, and therefore you have a left and right putamen, and also the globus pallidus. So let me add these onto our picture because we will see these if we take this cross-section through here. Okay, so we will do the putamen in first then, and we'll do it in green. So the putamen is more lateral, and it's sort of in this position here. So there's the left putamen cut through again, and here is the right putamen, like so. And now let me mark on the globus pallidus, and this actually is quite a good section for seeing the lenticular nuclei, because you do understand why they're called the lenticular nuclei when you see them in coronal section, because they do look like lenses. So here then is the globus pallidus, which can be divided up into two parts, the internal and external globus pallidus, but we're not actually discussing the function of the globus pallidus, so we won't divide it into the internal and external, but the inner part would of course be the internal, and the outer part facing the putamen would be the external. Okay, so these are the putamens, the left putamen and the right putamen, and these are the globus palliduses, the left globus pallidus and the right globus pallidus. More important structures, just to say whilst we're looking at this section, I mentioned earlier on when we were discussing the trigeminothalamic tracts and the spinothalamic tracts and the medial lemniscal dorsal, the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, that from the thalami, those neurons, the third order neurons that were going to carry the information up to the primary somatosensory cortex, went through the internal capsule and the corona radiator. And I didn't actually draw you pictures at that point. I just assumed that your neuroanatomy was good enough to know those basic structures. But now that I've got this section, I might as well just label up the internal capsule and the corona radiator. So, internal capsule. So the internal capsule is a white matter tract, effectively. It's loads and loads of axons, and it's this bunch of axons in this position here. All of this is white matter. In between the caudate nuclei and the lenticular nuclei, there runs loads and loads of axons here, and they're going to go up to the cerebral cortex, or they're coming down from the cerebral cortex. Indeed, the fibers that will make the corticospinal tracts, they'll be coming down here. So loads of fibers going up to the cerebral cortex and loads of fibers coming down from the cerebral cortex come through these portions of white matter that burst between the caudate nuclei above and the lenticular nuclei below, and those are called the internal capsules. And of course you have a left and a right one. And then the other thing that I talked about was the corona radiator, and that's after the internal capsule. So that's this portion of white matter here. So remember, the cerebral hemispheres, the surface is the grey matter, that's where all the cell bodies are. All of this underlying tissue, that's white matter, and that's where all the axons are. And this portion here, this is what we call the corona radiator. So the fibers coming up in the internal capsule, they will all radiate out in this bit to different portions of the cerebral cortex, and that's why it's called the corona radiator. Corona, I think, means crown, so it looks like a radiating crown, some crown of feathers maybe. Okay, right, so those are some basic structures just to know about when we're taking this coronal section. So that's just a bit of background knowledge. Now to the thing that we were actually discussing here, the middle cerebral artery. Where is the middle cerebral artery going to be? Well, remember, here is where the cavernous sinuses would be, and covering this bottom of the brain would be pia mater, and then under that pia mater would be the subarachnoid space before then the top wall of the cavernous sinus. So, where is the internal carotid artery going to be running? It's going to be running in this position here. So there's the left one, and there's the right one. Okay, so I hope that's clear. On top of the cavernous sinus, but underneath the pia mater that lines the bottom of the brain here. Now, let's imagine that we took this section very, very carefully. Let's imagine that we took this section precisely at the point where the internal carotid artery is going to turn lateralward and become the middle cerebral artery. Then we can see the middle cerebral artery penetrating through here, and it's going to penetrate through the pia mater here, it's going to penetrate through the brain tissue and go up like this, penetrate through the cerebral cortex up here of the insular cortex, and then penetrate through the pia mater into, again, subarachnoid space. So all of this is full with CSF, and then you'll have over here the arachnoid mater and then the dura mater outside of that. So you'll have loads of subarachnoid space here, CSF, so it's going to return to being extra-axial. So, thick pen at the ready. Let's put on the middle cerebral arteries. So we'll do it on the left-hand side first. So here it comes. It's penetrated through the pia mater here. It penetrates through the cerebral cortex, through the white matter, and it's intraaxial for this region. This is not extraaxial. This will not be innervated by meningeal nociceptors. Why am I talking about the middle cerebral artery then? Because it becomes extraaxial again, which is very important for us because it's a massive, great big artery. So it penetrates through the pia mater here, and then it's going to become extraaxial, and it has two major branches now. One that's going to go upwards like this in the subarachnoid space all the time, and then one that's going to go downwards and supply the temporal lobe like this. So the middle cerebral artery runs intraaxially for a while, then it becomes extraaxial again, and it splits into these two final branches, a superior branch that is going to go up and supply the frontal and parietal lobes here, and will be in the subarachnoid space, but of course its branches will come off it and penetrate through the pia mater back into the brain tissue to become intraaxial and supply that brain tissue. and then it's also got this inferior branch that is going to go downwards, running in the subarachnoid space over the temporal lobe, and which will have branches that penetrate through the pia mater there and supply the brain tissue there. So that's it on the left-hand side. I don't think I'll bother putting it on the right-hand side. It's the exact symmetry here. And by the way, these two big branches of the middle cerebral artery, they don't have particularly fancy names. We just call this the superior branch of the middle cerebral artery, and this one the inferior branch of the middle cerebral artery. Something else just to tell you about, because it's important background knowledge, is that whilst the middle cerebral artery is intraaxial, running through the brain tissue here, it gives off branches that supply the lenticular nuclei and also the internal capsule and indeed the caudate nuclei as well. So here we are. Here are branches coming off the middle cerebral artery whilst it's intraaxial, and these branches are all intraaxial. I'm just doing this for background. I'm not really interested in these. These aren't going to be innervated by meningeal nociceptors. I'm just giving you this background anatomy. So we have lots of branches coming off the middle cerebral artery as it's intraaxial here, and they go to supply the lenticular nuclei and the internal capsule, and that's very, very important because the internal capsule is extremely important. So remember, blood supply to the internal capsules comes from these branches of the middle cerebral artery. Now, what are those branches actually called? They're known as the lenticulostriate arteries. So lenticulostriate arteries. So I'll put A's there for arteries. Okay, right, so that is the middle cerebral artery done and dusted then. We've finished the middle cerebral arteries. They are major extraaxial arteries. Well, sorry, they're major cerebral arteries. They supply a huge amount of the cerebral hemispheres on either side. All of the lateral bit of the cerebral hemispheres is mainly going to be supplied by branches from the middle cerebral artery. And you have these massive, great extraaxial branches from the middle cerebral artery here, the superior branch and the inferior branch, and they will have meningeal nociceptors in their walls. Right, so that's middle cerebral artery done. The final cerebral artery that I want to go over is the posterior cerebral arteries. Now, this is difficult. Well, not difficult, but different. And you might be expecting me now to say that the posterior cerebral arteries, they probably come off the internal carotid artery before it becomes the middle cerebral artery, but they don't. They actually come off the basilar artery, which is formed from the vertebral arteries. So, up to this point, the only intracranial blood supply that I have told you about is the internal carotid arteries. However, there are also the vertebral arteries bringing blood intracranially, and these are big, big arteries, not as big as the internal carotid arteries, but still big, notable arteries, and you have two of them, a left vertebral artery and a right vertebral artery. So how do these arteries actually get into the skull? Well, they ascend up in the cervical vertebral column, in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, and then they come into the skull through the foramen magnum. And the first thing that they're going to do when they get into the skull is they're going to have to penetrate through the outer meninges. So they'll have to penetrate through the periosteal dura mater, the meningeal dura mater, and then the arachnoid mater to get into the subarachnoid space, so that they're now extraaxial brain arteries. And then they're going to run up the surface of the medulla. So let me draw a little picture then of the brainstem, and we have seen this picture before, so you should be very familiar with this picture. So I'm going to draw a very basic picture of the brainstem, and it's only going to be the, at the moment, the medulla and the pons level. So when I say I'm going to draw a very basic picture, what I mean is I'm not going to bother putting the medullary pyramids on or the inferior olives on. I'm just going to draw the medulla. So that's the medulla in green there, the basic shape of the medulla. And then in blue here, this is the pons above. Okay, so these brainstem levels, these are again, they're still part of the brain, they're going to be covered in pia mater. All of this is covered in pia mater. On top of the pia mater, you've got CSF, and then outside of the CSF, you'll have the outer meninges, the arachnoid mater first, and then the dura mater. So there is subarachnoid space on top of the pia mater here. The vertebral arteries come through foramen magnum, they penetrate through the outer meninges into this subarachnoid space, and they're then going to run on top of the pia mater on the front of the medulla here. So we're viewing the brainstem from the front here. So let me put these on here. So you've got one on either side. Here's the right one, so we're looking from the front, remember? And here is the left one here. And then they join together at the top there, and I now need an even thicker pen to form a big artery that runs on the surface of the pia mater on the front of the pons, and you only have one of those, and that's called the basilar artery. So let's label these up. So down here we have the vertebral arteries. Let me just check I've got the right thickness pen. Yes, I do. And then they fuse together at the junction between the medulla and the pons to form this great big artery that is still extra-axial in the subarachnoid space that runs up on the surface of the pons, on the anterior surface of the pons, on top of the pia mater, and that's called the basilar artery. Now, the posterior cerebral arteries are going to be the main branches of the basilar artery, and they are going to come off at the junction between the pons and the midbrain above. So let me add on to this picture the midbrain. So let me put on the midbrain. So here is, of course, the right cerebral peduncle. Here is the left cerebral peduncle. There is the gap between the two cerebral peduncles, like so. And then we'll have the superior colliculi at the back, like so. Okay, so there's a basic picture of the midbrain above. So at the junction between the pons and the midbrain, and again, all of this is covered by pia mater, at the junction between the pons and the midbrain, you're now going to have the basilar artery splitting into the two posterior cerebral arteries, and they go round the back of the medulla, like so. So, let me label those up. So these are the posterior cerebral arteries, and I think it will be okay for me just to abbreviate them down to the PCAs. So at the top of the pons, the basilar artery, which is formed from the vertebral arteries that have come up into the skull from the vertebral column, they've been running in the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, they are going to be formed and they will run round the back of the midbrain, and they're going to go round the back, and they're going to supply the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres. So there's a little bit of explaining that I need to do here, and this picture is going to be useful down here. So remember, in between the cerebellum and the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, there is a dural fold called the Tentorium cerebelli. And like I've discussed for the falx cerebri, this, although the actual fold is mainly made up of the meningeal dura mater, it's all going to be covered by arachnoid mater. The meningeal dura mater has the arachnoid mater running on top of it, and then outside of the arachnoid mater, you'll then have subarachnoid space before you then have the pia mater. And on the top of the Tentorium cerebelli, the pia mater will be covering the base of the cerebral hemispheres, so the base of the temporal and occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. Underneath the Tentorium cerebelli, the pia mater will be covering the top of the cerebellum. And in those spaces between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, there will be CSF. Now, in this inferior portion of the posterior cranial fossa here, you've got the cerebellum, but you've also got those bottom portions of the brainstem, the medulla and the pons. We have just said that the middle cerebral arteries, the posterior cerebral arteries, they are the terminal branches of the basilar artery, and they come off at the junction between the pons and the midbrain. The junction between the pons and the midbrain is at the level of the Tentorium cerebelli. So the pons is below the Tentorium cerebelli, the midbrain is then above the Tentorium cerebelli. So these posterior cerebral arteries, they're actually going to come round and they're going to actually go above the Tentorium cerebelli, in that subarachnoid space above the Tentorium cerebelli and below the pia mater that covers the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres. So they're going to be running effectively over the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, and they're going to come in exactly this position. They're going to run back in the positions that I'm showing you here. This will be where the left posterior cerebral artery runs, and this will be where the right posterior cerebral artery runs, and they will give branches that will go upwards, penetrate through the pia mater that covers the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, and then will supply that portion of the brain with blood. So it becomes necessary to draw another picture now, a picture of the cerebral hemispheres from the bottom. So let's try and do this nice and quickly. So I'll get a thicker pen back again. So we're looking now at the cerebral hemispheres from the bottom. We're imagining that we've chopped off the bottom of the brain. We've chopped off the pons and the medulla, which are the bottom portions of the brainstem. We've chopped off the cerebellum. We've made a chop, basically, a transverse chop at the level of the junction between the pons and the midbrain, which is the level of the tentorium cerebelli. So the cerebellum and the pons and the medulla, they're going to have gone, and we're going to be looking now from the bottom. We will see the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, and we'll see the bottom of the midbrain and the bottom of the hypothalamus as well. So let me now try and draw this here. So we're looking from the bottom. This is going to be the right-hand side here, and this is going to be the right temporal lobe there, and this of course is the longitudinal fissure back here. And then on this side we're also going to need a temporal lobe coming around like that, and then at the front here is the orbitofrontal cortex, and then again the longitudinal fissure at the dividing the two cerebral hemispheres, and like so. And that longitudinal fissure should actually come a little bit further forward, like this. Okay, now comes the complicated bit, to put in the structures in the middle, and for this I'll go to a thinner pen. So in this sort of position here, this is where the hypothalamus, the bottom of the hypothalamus is going to be. So you would have the pituitary gland in this sort of position here. There's the anterior pituitary and there's the posterior pituitary. Now let me just put in the midbrain. So the midbrain is going to be here, there are the inferior colliculi, and here are the cerebral peduncles, like so. And then, just to complete this picture up, you'd have the optic chiasm at the front of the hypothalamus in this sort of position here, and here are the two optic nerves coming off the optic chiasm. So, labelling this up, here is the base of the temporal lobes, here's the base of the occipital lobes. That posterior portion of the longitudinal fissure should come forward a little bit more. Here we have the base of the midbrain that we've chopped through. We've chopped through at the junction between the midbrain and the pons, so the pons would be underneath. Here's the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland dangling down, and here this is supposed to represent the optic chiasm and the two optic nerves, and then the optic tracts would be going above the temporal lobe, so we can't see those. Okay, so there's the background. Now let's put on where the posterior cerebral arteries would be. So they come round in this position. They're coming round. So the basilar artery was right at this sort of position, and then they're going to come round the sides of the cerebral peduncles like so, and they're going to go medially, and they're going to go into the gap within the longitudinal fissure here. And this gap within the longitudinal fissure is just like we discussed in the anterior place. There's the falx cerebri, but on either side of the falx cerebri there is going to be subarachnoid space that is in between the falx cerebri on either side, and then the pia mater that covers the cerebral cortex that faces into the longitudinal fissure at the back. So remember, going back to this picture, there is cerebral cortex at the back here that faces into the longitudinal fissure. That will be covered by pia mater, and then in between you'll have the falx cerebri, but on either side you will have a layer of subarachnoid space, just like this. Okay, so this is the cerebral cortex covered in pia mater, and here is the falx cerebri extending in between, and you can see that you've got two layers of subarachnoid space here where those arteries can go into, and indeed that's where they're going to go into. Okay, so there is the left one drawn on there, and then let's put in the right one like so, and it will also go medial like that. Now, before it actually goes into the longitudinal fissure, as I've shown here, it's going to give off a few branches, and the important branches to know about are the anterior temporal branch and the posterior temporal branches, which are roughly in these positions here. So let me label these up. So we have the anterior temporal artery, which is the first major branch that comes off the posterior cerebral artery. So that's the anterior temporal artery. So these ones here are representing the anterior temporal artery. This is the left anterior temporal artery, and this is the right anterior temporal artery, whilst these ones are the posterior temporal arteries. So I'll just label those up as well. And of course they're called the temporal arteries because they're supplying the temporal lobes, and they're running on top, or underneath rather, the pia mater that coats the bottom of the temporal lobes. So they are extra-axial arteries, and they'll give off branches that will penetrate that pia mater and actually go into the brain tissue to become intra-axial and supply the brain tissue with blood. Now, these posterior cerebral arteries, as they go into the longitudinal fissure, they become known by a different name, and they become known as the Calabrian arteries. And this is because they are going to supply a very important portion of cerebral cortex that runs, or that lines, the Calabrian sulcus. So those of you who know even the slightest bit of neuroanatomy will recognize the name, the Calabrian sulcus. A very, very important sulcus. Next to the central sulcus, it's probably, the second most important, maybe, the Calabrian sulcus. And I'll show you the position of this, because this is a sulcus on the cerebral cortex that lines the longitudinal fissure. So here is cerebral cortex lining the longitudinal fissure here of the right cerebral hemisphere. At this bit right at the back, and I will pick a big flamboyant colour that will actually show up. So we'll go for vivid purple, and I'll get a thick pen. Over here, right at the back, that I'm now colouring in here in purple, there is a sulcus. The cerebral cortex invaginates inwards. There is a sulcus here on that cerebral cortex that is facing into the longitudinal fissure, and that sulcus is called the Calabrian sulcus. So I'll put its name here. So that's the Calabrian sulcus. Some people actually even call it a fissure. You can hear it described as the Calabrian fissure. I would call this a sulcus rather than a fissure. I don't think it's quite big enough to be worthy of the title of fissure, but you can hear it called the Calabrian fissure. Now, of course, lining this Calabrian sulcus, there will be cerebral cortex. That's the whole point of sulci. They are invaginated portions of cerebral cortex to extend the surface area of the cerebral cortex. And that cerebral cortex that lines the top and the bottom of the Calabrian sulcus, and of course it will also be lined by pia mater. The pia mater follows all of the sulci, and therefore within the sulcus you will have a cerebrospinal fluid in between the two sides. That cerebral cortex that lines the Calabrian sulcus, that is the primary visual cortex. Whoops, pen. The primary visual cortex, also called V1, not to be confused obviously with the ophthalmic nerve. We're using V1 here not to mean the Roman numeral 5, division 1, but to mean primary visual cortex. So just like we called the primary somatosensory cortex S1, and you can call the primary motor cortex M1, you can call the primary visual cortex V for visual, and then 1 because it's the primary cortex. And we will come back to this because obviously we want to explore visual aura in migraine. So it's good that we're introducing the place where the primary visual cortex is at the moment. So this is where visual information is first brought to be processed. Visual information is relayed here just as somatosensory information was relayed up to the primary somatosensory cortex. And then there will be more advanced visual cortex areas that then further process it, that are also in the occipital region of the brain. But this is a very, very important sulcus with a very, very important portion of brain on it. Okay, so the Calabrian arteries will come up here in the subarachnoid space that we know is over the pia mater, but beside the falx cerebri. So we know we've got two pieces of subarachnoid space on either side of the falx cerebri. We've got a right one, and the right Calabrian artery will be running in that over the pia mater that lines the cerebral cortex, and it will send branches that penetrates through the pia mater to supply this portion of the brain. So it's a very important artery there, the Calabrian artery. So those are the major branches of the posterior cerebral arteries. We have the Calabrian artery, which it becomes, and then before that we have the anterior temporal arteries and the posterior temporal arteries being given off. Now, before we move on to discuss the cerebellar arteries, the superior cerebellar artery, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, let me discuss the circle of Willis, because we're now in a position to complete our discussion of the circle of Willis, because there is a connection between the posterior cerebral arteries and the internal carotid arteries. So let me go back to this picture, obviously, that I've got here, and let me mark on what we've just learned. So here are our vertebral arteries coming up to form the basilar artery here, and then the basilar artery is going to give off the two posterior cerebral arteries, okay? So those things that I've got there, those are the posterior cerebral arteries. So here is the left posterior cerebral artery, and here is the right posterior cerebral artery. Now, remember, everything is extra-axial. It's all in the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space over here is continuous with the subarachnoid space here. They're very close to one another. So you can build a little connection between the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral arteries. And indeed, this connection exists. So here, there's a connection here, and there's a connection here. And those arteries are, of course, called the posterior communicating arteries because they communicate with the posterior cerebral arteries. So the posterior communicating arteries there. And this now completes the circle of Willis. It's a circle of extra-axial blood vessels. Look, here, I'll trace it out. Here's the anterior communicating artery. Here's the anterior cerebral arteries. They form part of the circle of Willis. Here's the internal carotid arteries. Those form part of the circle of Willis. Then we've got the posterior communicating arteries here, the posterior cerebral arteries. And then we go back into the basilar artery, and there is a complete cycle there. And if you were a little man, you could swim round that cycle. And that is called the circle of Willis. And it's all extra-axial in the subarachnoid space. So that is the structure called the circle of Willis. Alright, so those are some major examples of extra-axial blood vessels, but all of the ones that we've seen so far are the branches that supply the cerebral hemispheres. So we've seen that the anterior cerebral arteries, they're going to give blood to a lot of the anterior portions of the cerebral hemispheres, so the orbitofrontal region, a bit of the frontal region, the very medial portions of the frontal region, and also, of course, this cerebral cortex that lines the longitudinal fissure at the front. The middle cerebral arteries, they are major. They do most of the lateral portions of the cerebral hemispheres, the bits that you see from the side, so the frontal and parietal lobes and the lateral portions of the temporal lobes. The posterior cerebral arteries, they do the bottoms of the temporal lobes, as well as the occipital lobes as well, the back of the brain. They do the bits of cerebral cortex that line the longitudinal fissure at the back of the brain, particularly where the primary visual cortex is, and they also do the occipital lobes right at the back of the brain. So what does the cerebellum? We haven't discussed what does the cerebellum yet, and now we're going to see three cerebellar arteries: the superior cerebellar arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and these are all extra-axial brain arteries as well. So let's start off with the superior cerebellar arteries. So these come off the basilar artery as well, and they come off just below the posterior cerebral arteries. So the posterior cerebral arteries are the terminal branches of the basilar artery, but before it produces its terminal branches, it produces the superior cerebellar arteries. So the SCAs for short. So these are the superior cerebellar because they're going to supply the cerebellum, and they are arteries, of course. Okay, so where are these going to run? They're in the subarachnoid space at the moment. They're on top of the pia mater, and they're also about at this level where the tentorium cerebelli is. However, whilst the posterior cerebral arteries went on top of the tentorium cerebelli, in the subarachnoid space on top of the tentorium cerebelli, the superior cerebellar arteries, they obviously need to go underneath the tentorium cerebelli if they're going to supply the cerebellum. So they go underneath the tentorium cerebelli. So let me go back to my picture of the tentorium cerebelli. So they go underneath this structure, backwards underneath this structure, in that subarachnoid space that is underneath the tentorium cerebelli, on top of the pia mater that is on top of the surface of the cerebellum, and they will give off branches that will penetrate through the pia mater on the top of the cerebellum to supply the superior portion of the cerebellum, hence why they are called the superior cerebellar arteries. Now let's have a look at the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So again, these both come off the basilar artery as well, and for short these are called the AICAs, anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So hopefully I don't need to write that fully out. So they come off much lower down the basilar artery, and again they're in the subarachnoid space, they're extra-axial, they go backwards around the pons to where the cerebellum is behind. Remember, the cerebellum would be behind our brainstem here. So they go backwards and they're going to go onto the surface of the cerebellum, and the surface of the cerebellum is going to be lined by pia mater. Because they're lower down, they're not going to go onto the superior surface of the cerebellum, because the superior surface of the cerebellum is up here. They're going to go onto the inferior surface of the cerebellum. They go onto the inferior surface of the cerebellum and are hence called the inferior cerebellar arteries, and because they're the anterior ones, they're called the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. And they'll have branches that will penetrate through the pia mater that covers the surface of the cerebellum and will become intraaxial and supply the cerebellum. So those are the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. Finally, the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, which come off the vertebral arteries, the picas, posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So these are also going to supply the cerebellum. They're going to loop back around the medulla on top of the pia mater. They'll then be on top of the pia mater that covers the bottom of the cerebellum and the posterior portion of the cerebellum. And you might be wondering, well, how come these ones are anterior and these ones are posterior? Remember that this brainstem is not vertical, it's on a slant. Looking at which picture? This picture here. This piece of bone is slanted here, this floor of the posterior cerebral artery. So the brainstem is on a slant and the medulla is further back than the pons. So when we have these branches coming off the vertebral arteries that are on the anterior surface of the medulla, they're going to be further back than these ones. So these are now going to go onto a more posterior part of the inferior surface of the cerebellum than these ones, hence why they're called the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. And again, they'll give off branches that will penetrate through the pia mater and will become intraaxial and supply the cerebellum with blood. So there I have now completed up my major examples of extraaxial brain arteries. We've done the anterior cerebral arteries, we've done the middle cerebral arteries, we've done the posterior cerebral arteries, and we've done the 3 sets of cerebellar arteries, the superior cerebellar arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So we've seen major examples of extraaxial blood vessels. Of course, we talked about how really the main bit of the middle cerebral artery isn't actually extraaxial, it's intraaxial, but it gives rise to these big branches, the superior and inferior branches, that are extraaxial. Now, this will be useful for us when we're discussing other forms of headache further on, when we want to discuss intracranial bleeds that can give rise to intracranial hypertension. We're, however, at the moment interested in the pathophysiology of migraine headache, and remember, the reason I've given you all these examples of extraaxial blood vessels is so that you have a good picture in your mind of what I mean when I say the extraaxial blood vessels in the subarachnoid space. They're in the meningeal layers, they're in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater in that subarachnoid space, and their walls are dense sites for meningeal nociceptors. And that's why we have studied all of this, because these arteries, the meningeal arteries and these extraaxial brain arteries, they are sites, rich sites of meningeal nociceptors. And the arteries, depending on where they are, of course, the nociceptors that innervate their walls will go in certain of the nerves that we have discussed. So we've discussed the innervation of the meninges, we've discussed the sites, we've discussed where the different nerves innervate the different regions of the meninges, and the arteries in a certain site, their nociceptors will be innervated by those same nerves that we've talked about for the site. That stuff that we went over about the innervation, that's all relevant here. So for instance, if you're talking about the anterior meninges, if we're talking about blood vessels in the anterior meninges, their nociceptors are going to go in through primary nociceptive afferents that will have their peripheral processes in the anterior branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerves, as we've discussed. So all of that stuff that we did earlier about the innervation of the meninges, that all applies to the innervation of the arteries that are within the meninges. What I'm trying to say is that the arteries will be innervated by nociceptors that will have their primary nociceptive afferents running in the same nerves as we've discussed for those regions earlier on. Okay, so we'll have a break here, and in the next video we can finally now move on to discuss the pathophysiology of migraine headaches.